water body that has known water quality problems, then that minimum buffer goes up to 30 feet and with a 60-foot average. What was the question?
Okay.
The Tennessee buffer is measured from the top of bank or from the ordinary high water mark, and the permit uses those terms relatively interchangeably and then defines ordinary high water mark by listing a number of characteristics that they look at to determine where you're going to measure it from. Things like where there's natural shelving in the floodplain from erosion, changes in the character of the soil, including the destruction of terrestrial vegetation, which is essentially the same concept as rested vegetation. So they look at rested vegetation as one of the components of measuring the buffer, but one that's in a list of other considerations. And they also acknowledge in the permit that this is a highly technical process and that there's going to be a certain amount of professional judgment that goes into it, and they recognize that in reviewing what permittees are doing. So in Virginia, they have established minimum buffer requirements in all of the watersheds that flow into the Chesapeake Bay. The Virginia House of Delegates, I believe they're called, passed the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, and that requires the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality to adopt buffers to protect waters that impact the bay. So the Virginia DEQ requires a buffer on perennial streams and other lands necessary to protect the water quality of the state. They require a buffer of 100 feet, again measured from the ordinary high water mark or the edge of the defined stream bed. And they also have similar guidance as to what ordinary high water mark means, similar to what Tennessee utilizes. So this is just a chart summarizing those findings. Again, this is only based on state level requirements. We didn't look at any local or regional requirements. And so with that, and so to wrap things up, I include these pictures to basically reinforce the thing that Tennessee states explicitly in the permit, that the drawing of these lines is kind of soft and fuzzy in all of the states that we looked at. And that's because where waters begin and ends gets to be a really complicated and murky question, no pun intended, in a lot of these scenarios. So that's recognized, I think, in the regulations of all the states that we have reviewed. So that I'll have to answer any further questions.
If you'll take just a second on your chart and just
Yes, ma'am.
just summarize it for us, and then we have several questions.
Okay, so in Georgia, you have a comprehensive statewide statutory buffer defined at 25 feet on all state waters and 50 feet on defined trout streams, measured from the point of rested vegetation. It means that every perennial or intermittent stream that has signs of rested vegetation has a 25 or 50-foot buffer. Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi have no statewide buffer requirements or state-mandated buffer requirements. In North Carolina, they have a 50-foot buffer on several watersheds, particularly distinct water quality impaired watersheds. And then they have a much larger buffer for one particular watershed in the Charlotte metro area. It's measured from the top of the stream bank or from the place where rooted vegetation is present, is first seen. No buffer requirement in South Carolina. And then Tennessee has a regulatory permit-based buffer requirement that's 30 feet on all streams and then up to 45 or 60 feet of an additional just less stringent buffer, measured from the top of stream bank or from the ordinary high water mark. And then Virginia requires a buffer for the waters that impact the Chesapeake Bay. They require a minimum buffer of 100 feet on all perennial streams, and that's measured from the ordinary high water mark or the edge of the stream bed. So.
Thank you. And we do have some questions. So our first question is Harold Reheis, number 26.
I got mine answered.
Oh.
I wasn't quite clear on one of the Virginia slides. It almost looked like 100 feet could be applied elsewhere, but it's only the Chesapeake Bay streams.
Is that correct?
That is correct. Only on waters impacting the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, thank you.
And only on perennial streams.
Yes, and only on perennial streams.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So your presentation is provoking lots of questions. So number 24.
Thank you.
EPD Director.
Yeah. Does North Carolina, Tennessee, or Virginia have a variance process
Like Georgia?
I can't, I don't know the details of it, but they do have a variance process. I can't compare it to Georgia's, and I haven't looked at that extensively, but they all do have a variance process.
Thank you. And number 3, you state your name and then Dr. Green.
It's not clear on your slide about Tennessee, but you stated it applies to all streams. Is that correct? It applies to all streams? Perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams?
I actually don't know if they apply, how they define all streams. That is how it's written in the permit, but I'm gonna guess that means intermittent and perennial as well. They probably do not apply it to,
So the language
ephemeral.
does say all in their language?
yes, in the permit it does say all. But again, it's up to the local governments to adopt ordinances that actually enforce that permit condition. So to some extent, it's gonna depend on what the local governments interpret that to mean and how they
Did
follow
you by
through.
chance look at any of the, any cross-section or sample of Tennessee municipalities to see how they implement that broad mandate?
You know, I did when I did this research back in like January, but I don't remember specifically what they said. I'll be happy to follow up on that
Okay.
and send you any information.
And just to be clear, the Virginia requirements on streams that drain into the Chesapeake applies only to perennial streams, not to
Yes.
intermittents?
Just the perennial streams.
Okay. Are there any exceptions there for forestry and agriculture?
To the perennial stream
Chesapeake
buffer
drainage,
requirement?
Right.
I don't believe so, no.
That's my understanding as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And number 4?
Hi, Mike Worley. Thanks, Scott. A couple of questions here. I know you said Georgia stream buffer requirements refer to rested vegetation, and from the presence of rested vegetation, did you take into account the Supreme Court ruling in 2014 on the specific statement, it applies only at the location of the rested vegetation?
Yeah, that's why I put that. That's why it's only measured on streams that present signs of rested vegetation.
Okay. And you said under the North Carolina stream buffer that the presence of rooted vegetation is the same as rested vegetation?
It's the other side of the line, basically, where you have, it's referring to the point where vegetation is not rested, where it's stopped to be.
Okay, but the way I read this is it's basically rooted vegetation on the stream bank, which is significantly different from rested vegetation.
Well, it's the place where you have rooted vegetation that has not been rested, where you first have the appearance of rooted vegetation,
Okay.
which is going to be just beyond the place where vegetation has been rested in function.
We're trying to figure out ways to clarify, as the chairman indicated. Tennessee required about 3 pages on our sheet here. I'm not sure there's a lot of clarification out of Tennessee. Do any of these allow for, not just Tennessee, Georgia allows and provides for exemption for agriculture, forestry, utility crossings, highway crossings, those kinds of things. Are those types of exemptions allowed in these other states?
I'm not aware that any of them have the kind of blanket exemptions for agriculture. They do have variance processes for crossings and for needed impacts, where a project requires it and can be offset in various ways. So they all do have a variance process to allow for disturbing the buffer, but I'm not aware of any particular blanket exemptions for agriculture or any other practices like that.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. And our chairman?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. At this time, I wanted to recognize Senator Jack Hill, one of our committee members that's here. And Jack, if you want to tell them a little bit about your district or just say hello this morning.
Number 12. Okay, thank you.
I represent the 4th Senatorial District, which starts up in Emmanuel County and goes all the way along I-16 all the way to Effingham County, just outside of Savannah. Ogeechee, Savannah River, Altamaha, Ohoopee, so got some good rivers in that area.
I was fortunate enough last week to spend a little time on the Altamaha. I did want to point out to our committee members one of the things I thought was ironic. I still think that the mighty Mississippi is the largest drainage basin in the U.S., and Louisiana and Mississippi have no state requirements that join the Mississippi.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for our presenter? Okay, you'll be around, won't you,
Yes,
for
ma'am.
discussion?
Always available.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Gerald Pouncey, Morris, Manning, and Martin. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
And to the committee as well. My name is Gerald Pouncey. As Madam Chairman mentioned, I'm a senior partner with the law firm Morris, Manning & Martin, and I've been practicing in the environmental area for the past 30 years, since the mid-'80s. Have also, here on behalf of the Council on Quality Growth as well, a board member and past chair of the Council on Quality Growth. And they and I were involved in the stream buffer legislation from the very beginning back in 2004. So a history that goes back with this. I would also ask the indulgence of the committee. This morning I broke my reading glasses on the drive in, so if you'll bear with me if I have to put them on and I'm
You
missing.
can have mine.
You know,
I bet we have everybody in this room who'd give you a pair.
Actually, I'll borrow
There we go.
Mike, you need to have your eyes checked. It is. I'd first like to mention that the stream buffer process and the stream buffer variance process, I do think represents in large measure an appropriate and reasonable accommodation between protecting the environment on the one hand and protecting property rights and the ability to disturb a buffer on land that you own or that you intend to own on the other. We've seen the implementation of this process evolve over the last 12, 13 years. In particular, two of your committee members have seen it as both past director of EPD and as current director of EPD. As I look at it, and it's really rested on two fundamental principles. One is rested vegetation, which we've heard a great deal about today, and the other is natural stream flow. Natural stream flow meaning, quite frankly, not ephemeral streams, but something where the flow is either intermittent or is perennial and is influenced by groundwater table versus simply the stormwater runoff that y'all see today. So I think that has been, in large measure, an accommodation of those two competing interests. If I look at the consequences of the stream buffer requirement and the stream buffer requirement from a variance standpoint, I think there are three primary consequences. One is time. The buffer requirements now and the variance process to be able to infringe on that buffer is running about 4 to 6 months. I would obviously defer to the current director, but I do think my observation would be that that group that handles those buffer variance requirement has a lot of demands on their time right now for those variances. I'll come back in a minute to how that might be addressed, or some thoughts about how that some of that might be alleviated. The second impact is going to result from what I'll describe as the secondary result of municipalities invoking their own form of the buffer requirement. Many of the municipalities around, not just the metro area, but around the state, invoke their own buffer requirement that is tied to, and their variance requirement that is tied to, the buffer requirement that the state has imposed. It uses, in many instances, either the same or almost exactly the same definition for both when a buffer is required to exist and when and how a buffer variance process must be implemented. But it generally imposes larger buffers. And with most of the municipalities, particularly in the metro area, you will see those buffers being 50 feet of undisturbed and another 25 feet. So effectively, you have a 75-foot buffer requirement on each side of the stream, and suddenly you have a 150-foot swath of land that you now have a burden imposed upon your property. A secondary consequence of that, which I have seen and unfortunately have experienced on a couple of occasions, is that municipality buffer requirement may be used almost as an end run around the zoning process. And I have seen instances where land was properly zoned. The buffer requirement was invoked on something which was, in fact, in this instance, a barely intermittent stream. There was quite a bit of debate about whether it was intermittent or not. And ultimately, the large development was denied because by a decision of 3-2 by the county commissioners, where the property was properly zoned, but the buffer was used as the means of preventing the development from moving forward. And in fact, that development did not move forward. So that I view as a secondary component. And so that's the second issue for me in terms of overall issues which we encounter as we deal with development or other intrusions on these buffers. The third component is what we have discussed today, and that is the lack of certainty about what rested vegetation is and where it starts, and the potential that as you are out with a particular official, for whether it's from EPD, for whether it's from the county, whoever it may be that is charged with enforcing that buffer in that instance, what their determination is going to be about where that rested vegetation begins, and secondarily, are we dealing with a stream that is influenced by natural flow, or is it a stream that is in fact ephemeral? And that is where we have experienced the levels of uncertainty that on occasion will put us in a position where we're not able to render solid advice to our clients, or if we're on the development side, unable to make strategic decisions because of that uncertainty. I want to come back to each of those three and make a couple of comments about each of those. Let me deal with the time first. I do think that on the time component, that there are perhaps other exemptions that could be considered. Things come to my mind, such as spillway repair, dam repair, pond maintenance, because of these ponds are very often invoked with a buffer requirement, where the argument is used that wave action creates rested vegetation on the pond, and as a result, everything from repairing a golf course to doing work on the agricultural side, work that need to be done, perhaps, for example, let's say that we're trying to remove sediment from a pond. Well, I've got to go into the buffer to remove sediment from a pond. And so there are 3 or 4 places that I think that some load could be taken off of EPD, where I really don't think that is that it is the intention or there's any real benefit derived by the buffer being in place for those types of instances. As to the municipality situation, I think that in large measure is going to run hand in hand with the third consequence, and that's the definition. Because I do think that the municipalities are going to continue, and probably wisely so, to follow EPD's lead on what the definition is that imposes a buffer. And so then it becomes incumbent, I think, upon EPD to consistently apply those definitions, if they're capable of doing that, if the definition is clear enough for that to be done. And then I think it is incumbent upon this body and then subsequently the legislature to look and see whether there's any fine-tuning that can be done to the definitions that would assist in making that definition more concrete. I don't know if that's feasible. I think it seems to me there are probably 3 primary options on that front. One is that you stay with the definition rested vegetation and address this through some additional exemptions that may be discussed. 2, I think there's the option of whether you consider stream flow to be a requirement, some amount of flow. I think the Corps, I go back to in many years ago, the Corps used an amount which I believe, as my recollection is correct, was 5 gallons a minute. But I just say that to say some consistent flow is needed. That's another option. Or you look at a drainage basin, and perhaps you do a combination. You say it needs to be rested vegetation plus one of these others, plus a stream flow or drainage basin. Once again, those are options. I'm not advocating for any of those. I'm just suggesting that if there's a serious look at have we gone too far on one side of the table in terms of creating an uncertainty about where this applies, and also if there's about the amount of buffers that are imposed across the state upon what all of us would recognize are legitimate streams to be protected, and those are the perennial streams. But if we're now taking it beyond that and looking at intermittent and then creating a confusion between where does intermittent stop and where does ephemeral begin, how we address those definitions. And as I mentioned, I think it's one or a combination of staying with rested vegetation or rested vegetation plus one of the other two items I mentioned, that is stream flow, some minimum stream flow, or some minimum drainage basin. I don't have extensive remarks today, though, and I can certainly circulate my notes on these comments to the committee. I would note that the economic consequence of this from the state side has really shifted more toward the time component that it has to whether a variance can be obtained. I think the process for obtaining the variance has become pretty clear and pretty specific, and that I think the economic consequence, though, is more one of a time component, except where you have the municipalities following the state lead, and therefore you have municipalities denying the buffer, tied more to what I would describe as zoning issues, but really in a context other than the formal zoning process. So I'll step back and entertain questions.
Thank you. And go ahead and just push your buttons for your questions, but I think it would be helpful. Your presentation was very good. It's very clear, and but there are going to be lots of questions.
Sure.
So number 4.
Yeah, just a few questions here. I'm trying to make sure I understood. Are you suggesting that rested vegetation, because you said at one point, stay with the definition of rested vegetation. Are you suggesting that that's an okay definition if we provide additional clarification for that as a general rule?
Yeah, I'm saying that is that definition itself is subject to varied interpretation in the field, and as a result, whenever you're looking at legislation, in my view, whenever I'm looking at legislation, and there is a varied interpretation of that legislation in the field, then some consideration ought to be given. Should that be controlling the determination of whether there's a buffer or not?
Okay. And you mentioned a couple of times some ag applications, but isn't agriculture exempt?
When I was mentioning the pond applications, and the pond application I used were ponds in a golf course or other ponds that may be around properties. I agree with you about agriculture. There is the exemption for agriculture in most contexts.
And the point you said where the buffer was being used to avoid the zoning process. You also said that the commissioners voted against that. I mean, isn't that part of the zoning process?
Well, in this instance, actually, the property had already been zoned for the use to which it was which was going to be employed, and therefore this was used as an end run around the formal zoning process, which has already taken place and already been granted.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir.
Number 10.
I can definitely verify his statements on the time. I got to be careful what I say. I'm about to submit a couple of buffer variance applications. So, it definitely. I think if you get it in 4, you're lucky. It commonly is exceeding 6. I just don't know that EPD has the manpower. I mean, I agree with that. I just don't know they have the people to process. But I was interested. You're talking about the rested vegetation. I can confirm in the field, it's implemented completely randomly, almost sometimes. I mean, I've had an LIA tell me there's no state waters in his whole county, and then all the way to someone wanting to take a roadside ditch. So it gets bad out there, and it needs to be cleared up. But I was wondering, what do you think about the definition of a state water? Because I think the whole program starts there. I think it's terrible.
Well,
that's just my opinion.
I agree that it arguably could encompass what's coming out of your faucet, potentially. And former Director Rehaus and I have had many discussions about the definition of state water. It is, I do think that it could be modified, but I think that it would be a challenge to do so, either both legislatively and otherwise.
That's the situation where you'd stay tuned to the legislature, and we'd probably throw our hands up in the end and not come up with any other solution, more than likely. Just frankly speaking. Okay, any more questions, sir?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And number 3, and then number 27.
Exempt under this act, as we heard in our last meeting, it is certainly covered by the federal Clean Water Act.
Yes.
And we have a very effective non-regulatory system using best management practices to address that. Now, there's a level of subjectivity in defining where a stream buffer begins under those guidelines. We have largely, I think, dealt with that by consistent training of the logging contractor and forester community for 20-plus years. So and maybe a member of the committee can answer this question better than you, but what ongoing training is out there to try to get people in the field making these calls to be more consistent? It doesn't really matter how we write this or what we base it on. When you're standing out there on the ground looking at a stream, you've got to make a call there, and there's always going to be some subjectivity. We just need to be consistently making that call. And what I'm hearing is we have a lack of consistency by the person making the call on where to start the stream buffer.
Let me check with the committee and see if anyone wants to address that question. Just press your button. That might be further research then on our part. I do ask for clarification. In the forestry industry, the best management practices is essentially voluntarily done by the members of the Forestry Association. Is that correct? In other words, you're under the exemption for ag, but you do your own best management practices. I don't know that that's clear to our audience. Mr. Green, if you can.
Sedimentation and Erosion Control Act passed by the state of Georgia, there's an exemption for ag and forestry, but there is no such exemption under the Federal Clean Water Act. So our activities there are not exactly voluntary. A better term is non-regulatory. We don't have to get a permit from the Corps every time we harvest timber or practice forestry alongside a stream, but we are expected to keep the stream clean, and many states use a non-regulatory system where you're expected to follow a certain set of practices that help us keep the stream clean, but you don't get a permit every time you do an operation, because these are ongoing across the landscape at all times. Now, since the '87 renewal of the Clean Water Act, states with such non-regulatory best management practice-based systems have to assess the effectiveness of those programs on a regular basis. So every 3 years, the Georgia Forestry Commission does a survey across the state of recently harvested sites to assess how well those are working. And where we're falling short and not doing as well, that becomes material that we cover in ongoing continuing education activities targeting the logging and forester community, so that they'll know that we're not where we need to be on, say, stream crossings. And this is how to do those right. And what we've seen is over time, that feedback loop has helped us improve our performance to where we're in compliance 90+% of the time on most of our key BMPs.
Thank you very much. Our next question, I think I said, was number 27.
Yes,
Thank you.
thanks. Mr. Pouncey, in terms of the timing required to obtain a stream buffer variance, on a project that I was involved in for a canoe launch on the Broad River in Madison County, we applied for the stream buffer variance. Went through the required public advertising period, and we received no comments during that time period. And however, our permit was being delayed an additional 30 days to review no comments. And I'm just wondering, is that an isolated incident, or is that something that anyone else has experienced?
I have not experienced permit being delayed for a specific additional period of time after a comment period had been received. So I can't speak to that component. It is and most, like you, I think most of these variances very often occur in the deal context of obtaining the stream buffer variance and obtaining the 404 permit as well. And that, I don't know if that involved your instance as well.
No, there was no
No 404?
No, well, there was 404 permit review concurrently, but they weren't tied together.
Chairman Gann?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. One of the things that, the court's decision on rested vegetation was kind of interesting for me. The way I interpret that is we could be in a watershed on one portion where we've got rested vegetation and this water here has a buffer. We move downstream, there's no rested vegetation, therefore we have no buffer. Said we move a little further downstream, there's rested vegetation, so we've got back to a buffer. Now, for me, I subscribe to the theory that if during the travel path of that water from where we said, okay, it needs a buffer, said I contend that water needs a buffer all the way till it gets to the ocean. Said and I think that there's some logic in that. The difficult thing for me is on the upper end of that watershed where we can't determine and I can take all kinds of officials. I've had hydrologists, I've had engineers. I've not had too many lawyers out. So, Mr. Ponce, I want to get you to come out and maybe you can give me some clarification. You sound like you might have a good answer, but on those watersheds to delineate a point where we say this is where we need to start that buffer. And you mentioned at one point the Corps using a certain flow rate. I contend, and one of the things that was exciting to me, Mr. Pippin's presentation that he made this past fall to our group, we talked about the Tennessee, and they have a number of acres and that was in relationship to MS4s, but I think that in Georgia, we might want to look at a certain size drainage basin before you get into, okay, this is what requires a buffer. Then you can really define it. A good surveyor go out there and tell you, okay, you're in this size basin now, this is where the buffer begins. And to me, the biggest thing that we do in any type of enforcement action is you have to have a clear understanding of what it is you're trying to get to the public to do or not to do. Now, I will ask you, because this is you mentioned golf courses a couple times, and I'm a terrible golfer, but I know that Chairman Hill's a really good golfer. Said for that, I want to ask when you're mowing along a golf course alongside a stream, I don't think anybody says that that's disturbing the buffer. Said the question comes up, and Dr. Green over here can tell me about some of this forestry equipment that can mow a 14-inch diameter tree. Said just depends on how big your mower is going to be. So when I'm in an area that we would say this is an area that requires a buffer, and I go back to the gentleman that was trying to clean out some snakes along a ditch, if he had mowed that with a type of skid steer or something like that, said that had a mower, one of these brush mowers, said is there a violation in that? Could you kind of address that from a legal standpoint of what you would see and how you would steer a client to in that area?
I'm a little bit reluctant, Mr. Chairman, to give legal advice to a committee such as this, esteemed committee such as this. But I would, there are instances out there where the buffer established and the requirement that you go through a buffer variance process to disturb that buffer reach the extreme, and I think a couple of those are examples that you described. And I think unless you can find an exception that is applicable to it, if somebody comes to me and says, "What have I got to do?" It's to, you're compelled to tell them there's a buffer variance requirement that you have to go through. And I think the only way to address those anomalies, if they're sufficiently occurring that they warrant that, is to look at additional exemptions, other than dealing with is what creates the buffer obligation to begin with. And I would come back, your comment on using just a basin, potentially as one option, just basin. I do think there's some advantages to the rested rested vegetation component, because I do think that serves to eliminate certain instances where a buffer might be required, where if you just go a basin approach, you might end up with buffers now being required in those areas. And I can think of wetlands and some other areas where if we just went with a basin component without having some other criteria as well, that might create an issue. So if for me, if I were to look at a definition, I would either have a stream flow requirement, I would have a rested vegetation requirement, and then I would look at the basin issue as supplementing those.
Is it, if I'm mowing on a golf course, would you defend me? You think I'm okay mowing along inside the 25-foot area if it's been mowed before?
You're doing no more damage than I do when I hit a golf ball when I'm 25 feet away from the buffer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think number 24 has an answer to this question, so, and then we'll get to number 4.
I won't get into the mowing, if that constitutes a land disturbance inside the buffer or not, but I think that would be the question. On the timing, I would just point out that the statute says upon a completed variance application, we have 60 days statutory obligation to make a decision, and we're required for a 30-day public notice. Now, there can be extra time. I don't know about reviewing no comments. It disturbs me. But I certainly don't dispute the 4 to 6 months, but I just wanted to point out some of the statutory. But Gerald, I wanted to see if you had any comment about, and I thought Senator Ginn was going to get to this, in terms of rested vegetation among a waterway, the discontinuity there, rested vegetation, no rested vegetation, rested vegetation. A, is that a problem? And B, if so, your thoughts about how to address that.
I think it is an issue. I think it's an issue primarily though in the urban settings where you have piped water, then you have an area where it is unpiped, where it has rested vegetation, and then you have piped areas again. So I do think that is that seems to me to be in certain areas a very low quality water feature that in that instance we're protecting. It creates a little bit of an anomaly as to why we're protecting it. On the other hand, there's still the variance requirement that exists, the buffer requirements that exist, so they're still able to get in and subject to the manpower capabilities within EPD, subject to able to get a buffer variance in those instances.
Any more questions? Okay. Number 4?
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with fully understanding whether a stream is in a culvert under a road or not, how that determines whether it's of significant value or not. When you talk about it's in a pipe or not in a pipe or something along those lines. I mean, from my perspective, if it's a statutorily recognized stream, I think we had decided that it was a valuable stream. So I'm just curious, can you clarify that some for me?
To me, there is a discernible different value to a stream, to us attaching a buffer requirement to a stream component where 90% of that waterway is piped and 10% of it is not piped, versus the value of a water feature where either 100% of it is not piped or a much larger majority of it is not piped. I think there's, if I'm looking at some of the water features in let's say downtown Atlanta or Metro Atlanta, where you may have 90 or 95 or 99% of that water feature is piped, and then what you're doing is you're protecting a 100-foot section of it and imposing a buffer requirement and a buffer variance requirement on that 100-foot section of a 5,000-foot piped feature. That seems to me a rather odd instance to use EPD resources to enforce that.
I understand that, and we don't need to get into big arguments, but if the whole purpose for establishing a buffer is to prevent siltation and pollution into a stream, if it happens in a 100-foot section or if it happens in a 3-mile section, it's still important. And if it happens before it goes into a pipe, it's just as easily preventing the pipe from being damaged or clogged. But that's a whole nother issue.
And I certainly agree with you about that. I think the only thing that I would note is most of the piping that I see is there's other contribution to that pipe in terms of water than just from the stream itself. Mainly it's surface water runoff, and mainly it's surface water runoff from infrastructure.
And Madam Chair, I would like to say I agree with Dean Green on the work with the silviculture industry. I've worked a lot with the forestry industry over the last few years, and find that their BMPs associated with their certification programs are absolutely incredible. They're actually well beyond what we are talking about here. So, but thank you.
Thank you. I see our chairman has a question, but I have, no, okay. My question to you is, based with the laws we have on the books, and considering some of the discussion we're having today, is there an area in which we can further clarify our problems through rules and regs as opposed to, as a first step, as opposed to legislation as the second step?
Madam Chairman, I would ask for some time to look at that. That's a great question, and I don't want to answer prematurely. I'd like to give some thought to that.
I realized I kind of threw something out there, but I've been thinking about that, and also realizing the difficulties we have in the General Assembly in trying to come to consensus on legislation. But the point of clarification is what I think we're all trying to, in a way, address.
Certainly.
And if we can do it immediately with a rules and regs process, then perhaps we can further gain knowledge as we go forward with trying to change the definition.
If you're comfortable, when I provide my notes for my discussion today, I'll provide, if I have something that I could offer in that regard, I'll include that as well.
Thank you. So we're kind of making your day today. You broke your glasses. You've been asked to submit a huge report to our committee, but we very much appreciate your time. Any further questions from our committee? Okay. Thank you very much. And our next presenters are going to present together, Kathleen and Joel, representing our municipal and our county governments. And if y'all would just both introduce yourselves. And let me ask you, would you prefer sitting at the table? Would that be easier, or you have something to?
I just had a map I was going to present. If it's over
Okay.
there.
I'll let y'all choose where you wish to sit.
Do we need to move a mic there?
Yes, we have no mics, so I'll take that back.
We'll stand here.
Okay. Thank you. And if y'all will both introduce yourselves before we begin.
Any suggestions on how we get that? Okay. So I'm Kathleen Bowen. I'm here representing the Association County Commissioners of Georgia.
And I'm Joel Wiggins with Georgia Municipal Association.
So I'll go first. In your packets and on the screen now, you'll see a map of the state of Georgia, and you also have a spreadsheet that details the buffer requirements for each county. So the blue are, on your map, the blue is showing the stream buffers that are at the state minimum, and the tannish yellow color shows stream buffers over the state minimum. So this information, we got this from surveying our members and reviewing county codes and ordinances. So I was asked specifically to share information with you on the counties that had stream buffer requirements over the state minimum. Thank you, Trey. So currently, if you're looking at the map, 128 counties, or 80.5%, have stream buffers that are at the state minimum. So the state minimum being the 25 feet for warm waters, 50 feet for cold waters. So those are the counties in the blue. So there's 128 counties. We already have a question.
We have one
Yes,
question,
sir.
yes.
Yeah, I said I'm not sure how accurate your data is.
Okay.
I served as a county manager in Franklin County. I noticed that it's not in the list, but there's a county ordinance in Franklin County that any municipal water system 7 miles above that, it moves to 150 feet, and you'll see that quite often throughout the state of Georgia. Said and quite honestly, most county commissioners, if you went and asked them what the stream buffer is, they can't tell you. Said that most of the staff can't tell you. Said and this is where we run into enforcement problems with, if the public's unclear about what the rules are, they're bound and determined to step into the wrong area. So for me, when I look at, there were a lot of regional commissions do a really good job of moving one ordinance from one location to the next, to the next, to the next, and that happens all over the state. And I'd be willing to bet you're a lot more than you would think you would see.
Do you know if Franklin County is a local issuing authority?
They are not.
Okay, so there's 102 local issuing authorities that are counties. That is where you start, that's where you can start your research. And then for those that aren't local issuing authority, that's where it does get more complicated. So I agree.
And that's why I want to try to make sure that if somebody used this map, they'd be in violation of those buffers real quick in a lot of places. And to me, that's probably the biggest thing that I see, that the public doesn't want to violate the rules.
Mm-hmm.
They want to follow the rules, but we need to make the rules a little easier to understand.
So out of 159, I can tell you that 102 of these, because we follow the local issuing authority, there is good data on those that are the local issuing authority. It's those cases like you mentioned, Franklin County, and your home county, Madison County, as well. That's not a local issuing authority, but they do have requirements over the state minimum. So I'll go back and check on Franklin County.
And I think we have some clarification or a question as well from Harold Reheis.
Chairman, again, I've got a hunch that if there's part of Franklin County that has 150-foot buffers, and you mentioned 7 miles, that would be 7 miles above a water intake on a stream that is used for municipal water supply. So we do have several kind of buffers in this state. There are those on small watersheds that are for water supply, and then there's a statewide 25-foot buffer or 50 on trout streams. And if you put on this map every county that may have a drinking water intake on a small watershed, then there may be some additional counties that ought to be there that aren't. But again, that generally would not be countywide. It would be for one watershed within the county.
And quite honestly, I was the city manager before I was the county manager, and the city of Royston, their intake for the city of Royston's water supply is on the North Fork of the Broad River, which is a sizable drainage area for the county. And to me, it's not countywide, but that's where, if I'm looking at this and kind of here's where we are.
Right. Okay. So 31 counties have the stream buffer requirements that are above the state minimum from the data we found, Senator again. But the majority of those counties, as you'll see, 15 of them are in the Metro Atlanta Water Planning District, and they do recommend more stringent stream buffer requirements than EPD. And as Mr. Reheis said at the last meeting, most of the governments in the Metropolitan Water Planning District do follow those recommendations from that group. So as we learned the last time, EPD does enforce the Georgia Erosion and Sedimentation Act, but they do allow local governments to be the local issuing authorities, and they can go over the state minimum. So local governments can protect watersheds through their ordinances. And if you're looking at that map, I know in my mind, Lee County stands out. Well, that has the Flint River there, so there's a Flint River corridor that they're protecting. If you look at Berrien and Lanier, they're protecting the Alapaha River corridor as well. So, and in your area, Senator, again, Oconee, Jackson, and Madison, they have some buffers in some areas that protect what they consider environmentally sensitive waters. So that is what's going on in that part of the state. But I will pause. If you have any questions about one of the counties that is in the yellow or peach color, I did give you an Excel spreadsheet with data for every single county. And we can go back and look at those like Franklin County that aren't the local issuing authorities, because those are the ones we'll go back and check.
Are there any questions at this point?
If not, we'll let Joel.
Probably because we don't know enough to ask the questions
we'll
yet.
We'll let Joel speak about the cities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank y'all. Michael McPherson was supposed to be speaking with y'all today. He is our expert on environment and natural resources, so I'm pinch hitting for him. but we did have, we surveyed our cities that are local issuing authorities, and we have provided you with the data and with a explanation of that data. And of the 58 cities that responded to our survey, 30 have a higher than state minimum requirement. Of those 30, 27 are in the North Metro Water District. The other 3 are in North Georgia, and 2 of those that stood out was Ellijay, which has a around the Coosawattee River, and then Dahlonega, which had an extra around their reservoir. But that was the only things that we saw. It's somewhat consistent with what Kathleen was talking about, either protecting rivers or following water district planning or state law.
Any questions? Tell Mike you don't need him anymore and that y'all can handle this on your own. Thank you. I didn't see any questions. Chairman Ginn has asked that we take a 5-minute break. We still have another presentation coming up from Chuck Anglin, and we really appreciate you being here, sir. It's the Georgia Association of Assessing Officials. And before we take this brief break, Benton with GSWCC has some brochures to hand out for us that will go back over some of the areas that we asked questions of last time. So just put them on our desk if you want to, or do you want to comment to us, or I put you on the spot, so. Okay. Yeah, you're smart to avoid that. Yes, thank you. All right, we'll be back in 5. Thank you. So we have everybody back, and we have a final presenter. So, Chuck Anglin, is that correct? How are you? So we're all locked and loaded, but actually you've got lunch ahead of us, so I think so maybe we'll be quick with our questions, but we really appreciate you being here. And are you the director? Or if you'll explain you're going to do how the assessor's office works, and so. All right. I'm sorry. All right, there you go.
All right, good morning. I guess
Good
it's still good
morning.
morning. I'm Chuck Anglin. I'm the chief appraiser in Putnam County. I just became chief appraiser a month ago in Putnam County. I was chief appraiser in Morgan County prior to that. And Senator Ginn probably remembers me from being chief appraiser somewhere else, but a long time ago. That gives our ages away. I'm not going to say anything about that.
And your information's in our folder?
Yes, ma'am. And
Okay,
I'm
if y'all take
currently-
a second and find that.
Currently the president of the Georgia Association of Assessing Officials, or GAAO for short. And I'll be the president for 4 more days until the next one comes online, so it's been fun. And I'm here to talk about how we value property and what we have to consider and things like that. And I can streamline that into talking about stream buffers and show you and talk about it when we get to that point. But basically, there's 2 types of appraisers out there. There's a fee appraiser and a county tax appraiser. I'm both of these, but I'm not practicing fee appraisal anymore. A fee appraiser is the person who comes to your house for a bank loan or something to that nature. And the county tax appraiser comes to your home is for taxes. And the fee appraiser is governed by USPAP, and the county tax appraisers are governed by Georgia law and Department of Revenue regulations. And the Department of Revenue is the one who actually does our training and education for all of our appraisal courses. You can go to other places to get courses as well, too, though. The fee appraiser generally uses 3 comparable sales. They come up with 1 property value. The county tax appraiser will use all the sales within Putnam County or in the county that you live in and value all the properties within the county. And with the fee appraiser, you're usually happy after he leaves because you're either getting your a mortgage or you're fixing to buy a house. And when I come out there, you're generally not too happy. So, told you. Georgia law, there are 4852 is the law that tells us what things we have to consider. There are 4 major ones and there's 4 minor ones. The 4 major ones apply to the mass appraisal process. These things that we shall consider when appraising property. First one is zoning. Use, the ones in yellow or gold are the ones that apply to mass appraisal. Covenants or deed restrictions, which is kind of like a stream buffer. Foreclosures and distress sales. Rent restrictions, Section 42 properties. That takes a full day to talk about that, so we're not even going to look at that. Income approach on properties that have income or income properties. And conservation easements, that's also about a half a day's worth of discussion. But then the other one is any other factor deemed pertinent. And that can cover a lot of things. But there are 3 major factors under this any other factor deemed pertinent. First one's location, second one's location. You've heard that before. Where a property's at determines its value. If you have a property, this same house out in the country and on Lake Oconee, there are 2 properties. You know which one's going to sell for a lot more. There's other factors that are negative factors. Properties on dirt roads out in the rural areas. Some of them don't even have internet connection out there, and cell phone service. Power lines running through your property could be negative factors. The topography or flood zone that could be an issue on your property, make it negative. There can be positive factors too, such as having a property that looks like that. I took that picture. I'm awful at taking pictures too, so that's a great picture. So, other positive factors could be a property on a corner that's zoned commercial. That's a Walmart on 441 South in town of Madison. Covenants or deed restrictions. There's something by deed or a covenant of a subdivision, covenants that allow things to happen on your property or not happen to your property. The most common things that we see on a deed restriction will say no poultry houses, no swine, no mobile homes, and no junkyards. Those are the most common 4 things we see that are by deed restrictions. That you usually have a bundle of rights to each property. You take away rights from a property, it affects the value. It can be negative effect and positive effect. But covenants or deed restrictions can also limit the size of houses or make a certain size house in a subdivision, and that could make the value higher. And limiting those things before can also make the value higher. And they can also restrict certain types of buildings being built on types of properties too, which can affect the value of all properties, positively and negatively. The use of the property, their primary use of the property, we break it down into how the property is primarily used: residential properties, commercial properties, industrial properties, agricultural properties, exempt properties, and public utility properties. Those are the 6 major classes that pay taxes on properties. Well, exempt properties don't pay taxes, but those are the 6 classes that we have. And inside agricultural, you can have several different other groups: conservation use, FLIPA, preferential, zoning. The zoning of a property is a big deal, as you know, don't you? Yeah. The most common zoning is R1 in every county. That's a residential property, single family, 1 house, and it sets the values and sets what can be built on a property. It also sets how far a property can be built from the back of the property, from the front of the property, and from the side of the property. Zoning, what determines the value. Zoning equals the money that's involved.
I think we have a question.
Yes.
Wait a minute.
Chairman, thank you, Chairman Smith. Tell me, when you value a piece of property, the zoning, you take into consideration the zoning, or you take into actually what it's used for?
The use.
Okay, only the use, not what it is zoned, but only the use.
Only the use, but the zoning can determine the market value of the selling prices of property in that area. So,
But an industrial or commercial piece of property that's used as agriculture is taxed as agricultural property.
correct.
Thank you.
But more than likely, when it sells, it's going to sell a lot more than agricultural property would, and it's going to sell for a lot more. And that's it. At that point, it stops becoming agricultural property. You know when it stops becoming that use by the selling prices of properties.
On the subject of zoning, there are some counties that have absolutely no zoning.
Yes, ma'am.
What happens there?
You have spot building. You could have things pop up in areas that normally wouldn't happen. Commercial buildings that happen in the middle of residential areas, commercial buildings that happen in the middle of agricultural areas, or vice versa too. You could have agricultural stuff happening in the middle of residential areas, and that zoning is a county thing that needs to that prevents and helps things not happen and happen inside of a county. And it's hard. I would think it would be really hard for counties without zoning.
Well, it becomes hard on the legislature is
I
what
would imagine
happens.
so. Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you.
But the zoning, like you have these 2 properties. I don't know if you can see their lines on the screen, but they're side-by-side properties, and you would think that they would be valued close to as rural properties. But one of them is zoned AR, which is agricultural residential. The other one's zoned lake residential. The one on the lake LR1 can be subdivided into 1 acre lots. The AR property can be divided in 2.5 acre lots. So someone would be willing to pay a lot more for that LR1 property versus the AR property. So zoning has a big play on what a potential buyer would look at as far as the density of the number of lots he could develop out of a property, or what he could do with the property. Without zoning, he could do either one. I mean, he could do what he wanted to, I guess. So, or she, sorry. So zoning use, covenants and deed restrictions, and any other factor deemed pertinent. Those are the major things that we look at and compare sale prices of property to determine property value. When you have a stream buffer will be more in line of a covenant and deed restriction and a zoning regulation at the same time. We have available to us, we have FEMA maps that show the flood zones of the whole county, and we can see what areas are not buildable under those areas. The flood zone properties are not buildable, and we value that area of owned properties as a minimal, as at a minimum value. But some of the properties can become totally unbuildable at that point. They're not unusable; they can still be used for hunting or anything else, but they can't be built on. And so that's a right that's taken away from that bundle of rights. Once you remove that, that would be a negative thing to happen to the property, removing that certain right to the property for valuation purposes. Not a negative thing happening, just negative for valuation purposes. But we'd try to determine.
Another question,
Okay.
I think, Chairman.
You know, we have an expert in our audience that's a stream mitigation expert. And one of the things that, for me, if I sell the stream bank credits or stream mitigation credits on a piece of property, to not develop it, how do you take that into consideration in hunting property, timber property? You know, how's that play in?
The stream mitigation properties are an animal all to themselves. There's nothing else like them. I had one in Morgan County. It was a large tract of land that sold the rights to other people, basically the Department of Transportation and other counties for if they wanted to cross the streams or cross rivers with bridges. They paid, I think, $20,000 to $30,000 per acre for 400 acres of land. But the money they receive off that mitigation is something else. There's no way to value. There's no other comparable properties out there to value it like that. But once they start mitigating that land, it's forever untouched. It becomes untouchable, unusable land, and it has no value. I mean, other than hunting, it has a minimal value. That's basically what it has. It's the same as a conservation easement. At that point, a conservation easement is perpetual loss of rights to do something on your property. It causes a diminution in value once that happens. You lose one of those bundle of rights. You lose that, and it causes that value to decrease. And in some cases, it can decrease the value up to 60, 70, 90%. And that's what we've seen through sales of property for properties with easements and mitigated properties like this.
We have another question, number 26.
Yes,
Harold Reheis.
Harold Reheis, Joe Tanner and Associates. So I know that every foot of every stream in Georgia has a buffer on it if it's an intermittent or a perennial stream, buffer requirement. I know that only a tiny fraction, small fraction, a few percent of all of the stream miles in the state are covered by a FEMA map that'll tell you where the 100-year floodplain is. And I can understand that if something's in a floodplain, it's going to have a lower value than something that's not. But where you don't have a FEMA map, what do you do if a piece of property has a stream through it and there is a 25-foot buffer or some larger one assigned as a result of state or local law? How is that valued in Putnam County and maybe in any others that you know about?
I can answer. That's a good question. We in Putnam County, we do have the FEMA maps, but in every county in the state of Georgia, they have a soil survey that's been done on these properties. The properties that are on the stream buffer, on the streams, have a certain type of soil, and it's usually a very productive soil with a very specific soil type of classification that tells us that this is water. You can't get to this property, and in those counties, that's what have the lower nominal value for that property. It's easy. You can find that property that way. You can find the stream buffers in it. I don't know the specific salt type that it is, because there's thousands of salt types in the state of Georgia, but that's generally the way you would find it without FEMA maps.
Further question? Go ahead.
I would think a lot of people who have a stream on their property view that as an asset. But if there is a buffer associated with that stream, then it's limited as to what they can do if they
Right.
want to develop the property. So how does that affect your decisions in assessing a property for tax purposes?
Good question. Again, the size of the tract is going to come into play a lot of times. A very large tract, 50 acres and above, if there's a stream with buffers, the effect is nominal. I mean, unless the floodplain runs over the whole 50 acres, which is doubtful, the effect is nominal. You're talking 2 or 3 acres of land with a stream running through it, this low lying, the effect could be very devastating to the value of the property. That property owner may never be able to sell that property because of those issues on the property.
Okay.
And that's going to cause that value to sink. I'm sorry, I keep hitting buttons or something, sorry.
Thank you.
To follow up with that statement, in more rural areas that are turning suburban, and people own tracts of land, but they didn't realize that there was an additional 25-foot buffer added to their property. And if the stream meanders, just think of a up and down radiator type shape. So a 25-foot buffer imposed by the state, and an additional 25-foot buffer if you're in the Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District. So you're looking at 50 feet, which can actually abut from one side of the stream to the next. How does an assessor take that into consideration?
A lot of times, the way a builder or developer draws the plat for his new subdivision is going to take those areas into account, because the counties usually require some type of green space, and they're going to maximize their areas around that. So they're going to make the green spaces the areas that he can't build on, and that those properties will be forever green spaces, and they have a nominal value. I value them at $2 because they're part of the subdivision. They're part of the selling price of the other lots. And most counties do value them either $100, $1,000, or $10, $2, things of that nature.
What I have found is in my community that there are tracts of land within a city area or very near a city, and so they're smaller tracts of land, and they're paying high value property taxes on it, and then they go to try and develop it, and they can't, even with variances. It becomes so limited. So what's the scenario for the property owner and the county with that assessment?
The property owner should first file a return at the beginning of the year that's where you come in and you declare a value, and you let the tax assessor's office know what's going on with your property. If you don't do that, file an appeal and write the reasons why you have issues with the value of your property, and let them know, and provide documentations and show these things like that, and they'll lower the value. They should lower the value. I can't promise you. I only work in one county, and there's 158 others out there. So,
and I think at this point, to all of us who are trying to figure out this issue, the Constitution protects home rule very strongly. And so what happens is, what is apparent as a general measure of how to value things varies depending upon what that county, the emphasis of that county is. Is that correct?
that's correct.
So a taxpayer, I worry about the ability of a taxpayer to understand what's going on before they even buy their property. I mean, are these things easily viewed and posted, or what happens there?
Well,
I mean, it's a big situation in my
it
area,
is.
obviously.
and you have some counties that I consider myself one that's very transparent and try to show people what's going on. We try to be very helpful to people, and I know there's there's probably some out there that are opposite of me, and they try to confuse people. One of the things I know that confuses people right off the bat is the difference between appraised value and assessed value. Is appraised values 100%? That's what the value is. Say if we have your property value at $100,000, that's the appraised value. The assessed value is 40% of that, or $40,000. I don't know why that was put into place like that. That was way before I think any of us in this room came into play. So, but that's the way it is. But that whole thing is confusing the taxpayers, and the millage rates and all those things are. It's very. It can be very frustrating to our property owners, and we try to show them how everything works that way. But I hope that all 158 other counties are too. But I can't promise you that.
Thank you. And I see number 27 first and then number 4.
Mr. Anglin, Phil Monroe, Madison County. When you appraise a parcel of land that in that county there's a stream buffer, you take into account what that width is, and then that specific acreage, and then assign a value to that acreage separate from the other land within that parcel.
Yes, sir. But I use the FEMA maps to do so. And usually the FEMA flood zone is a little bit wider than the 25-foot buffer. So that's what we're able to delineate. Using GIS, we're able to quickly delineate that acreage in there. So we know exactly how many acres was in the flood, and we'll put the nominal value on that.
And you diminish that value?
Yes, sir.
By what measure?
I generally use $500 per acre on rural properties. Like if they're selling at $5,000 per acre, I'll use 500. If it's 6,000, how the average is doing, if the average is 5,000, I use 500, 6,000, 600. I usually put it to that percentage, so 10%.
Okay, if that particular piece of property, the intrinsic value of that piece of property is because it's, say, on a very large river that has a nice viewscape, would you increase the value of that buffer because it is an amenity for that piece of property?
Absolutely, yes, sir. I know properties on the lakes and rivers, they sell for a lot more than properties out in the other areas of the county. And that's just shown through the market.
Even though that piece of property cannot be utilized by the property owner?
Well, it depends on what part they can utilize. If they can utilize it, it's going to have a greater value. But if they can't, it's not. I mean, if the whole property is sitting in the flood zone or in that 25-foot buffer, it's not a big property to begin with. But it is. That's how we look at it, though. I mean, if it's usable, it's going to have a greater value usually on a lake or on a river or the lake. Now, a stream, maybe not that big of a difference, but definitely on river properties.
Okay, thank you.
Number 4.
Let me just make sure I understand fully. If I could try and kind of boil this down, what you're saying is essentially stream buffers, non-stream buffers, big streams, small streams, the value of the property is already, the appraisers have already taken into account buffers.
I do. I don't know if the other counties have or not.
Okay.
I do that.
So properties are already valued at what they're valued.
Yes, sir.
And whether there is a buffer or isn't a buffer, I mean, it's valued at what it is. You guys take all of that into account when you're appraising a property.
Right, and you can't see that on your assessment notice that you get in the mail. All you're going to see is the total value, which is going to have the land, the house, any accessories that are involved, pools, driveways, barns. All that's going to be just one value.
Gotcha.
So you'd have to come in to see actually how they value your land to see if that is taken into account. And you should be able to see it fairly quickly in their land schedules.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
That's all.
You have more to present, right?
No, ma'am. I was just going to say that fair market value is what a knowledgeable buyer would pay and a willing seller will accept. That's what an arm's length transaction is. That's a normal sale. between brothers is not an arm's length transaction. If you, any affiliation is not considered a fair market sale. That's what we look at for comparable sales, but that's all.
See if
all
I
I
see any other questions.
And if you ever need, if you ever have any questions about property values or property tax situations on this or any other legislation that you run across, feel free to contact me at any point in time, and I'm always willing to give you, or my answers may not be what you want to hear, but it may be something, I may be able to help you, so.
Thank you. I will say for individual property owners, it's just a maze, and it's difficult for them to understand how the process works. Is there like is it, if you buy certain items, they're listed and then you know what your total is? Is there any way to have an overview of the existing value and show where the buffers were considered? I mean, is it spelled out anywhere for the individual?
It should be in the land schedules on each individual property. They should be able to find that inside their property records. And it may be on the county's website where they post the values. It may have the actual land schedules on there. Some may not, but it's going to show you if that, it's going to be a productivity on larger tracts, and it should be a very high productivity number, which means it's a low value, like a 9. You should be able to find that in that schedule, but the tax assessor is going to have to explain it to you because it's complex.
It is.
And as we're required to do that by law too, so that's by the appraisal procedure manual dictates for us to value properties and take that soil type into account. So if the county's not doing it, they're in violation of Georgia law.
And we have another question, but I guess my concern mainly is this. It is unusual for a private property owner to have the confidence, the knowledge, or whatever to know to challenge that. And usually a group or an organization has more of a united voice. And so my concern is that this information is not getting to our individual property owners. Therefore, they do not know how to go about challenging. Is there any way your organization could make that process clearer for the property owners?
We through the internet is one way we try to do, and try to not just put schedules out there, but narratives that explain why it's being done this way. That's the way I do it, and I try to encourage other folks to do it the way I do it.
So just clone yourself for 158 other
Yeah.
counties. Okay, so we have a couple more questions for
Okay.
you. Number 4 and then number 9. Okay.
Just one quick question, or you seem very confident in your ability to assess the value of the properties. Does it matter to you whether there's whether you're using floodplain, whether you're using rested vegetation and establishing a buffer from a piece of land, or does that matter to you? You're confident with the assessments that you can do?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number 9.
Yes. Is it fairly subjective how you pick? I mean, you were saying the value is reduced in some cases down to 10% of the value of the land surrounding it. Is there some formula that you go to? Is it just your experience?
It's just experience, and like you said, it is subjective. I would hope that they would see that would be a diminution in value. But there are I've seen appraisals where the diminution has happened, and that's what I use as my tools and my data to use. So I've seen other appraisals done by fee appraisers that show properties that have been perpetual easements been put on them, and then what happened to the values of those properties. So that's what I've always used.
Because at some point you were saying a buffer as a deterrent, whereas a stream with a view could be an enhancement, and how to determine, would you go out and look at it? Or
But the market's going to determine too.
The sale price of
the
the
sale price is going to determine that. And until something actually sells, you can't say it is valued higher. You can't just say, oh, I think it's going to be valued higher. You have to have justification. Or you're going to lose. I mean, you're going to get beat at Board of Equalization, at Superior Court, and Supreme Court.
would it be on an individual track, if it were of the appropriate size, to pull out percentage-wise that's in a buffer and almost put into a conservation easement? I mean, I know that's dictated by overall sizes, but in values,
Well, that,
and be charged at that rate.
yeah, it would be, the tax assessor's office at that point should value it at very, very low rate. I mean, if you put that in a perpetual easement,
That isn't a buffer similar to a perpetual easement?
correct. But it's not at the same time. I've seen it over time that the actual stream can move from over 100 years' time, the stream can, this was the property line back in 1905, but 2010, the property line's over here, just through erosion and every other thing
Sure.
else. So that can't, a perpetual easement, put in place right there now the stream's over here, it's kind of be
Right.
so you have to, that to me would be, you'd have to be a big perpetual easement, it'd be a lot larger.
Thank you.
And then number 10?
You said you determine the, whether a buffer's on a property or not based on the FEMA map?
Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I think you do more than probably most counties in that regard, so I'm not nitpicking, but, you know, in my career looking at maps, I'd say, I don't have a number that I can defend, but, you know, probably 3/4 of streams that are buffer eligible in the state are not in a flood zone. So there even could be lots of property that's still getting taxed and that buffer's not coming out, even in counties that are trying to account for it. You can't delineate the whole county. I mean, I understand that, so just a
But-
point I wanted to make.
If you had a large tract, if it was 1,000 acres and it had a stream running through it, a 25-foot buffer is very nominal on that. And so it's not, the effect on value on that property is nothing. But if it's 10 acres of land, it could be a lot more. That's it. And so you have to look at those situations. What would it do to that property? Would it make it buildable or not? That's one thing that I really look at. What rights does the property owner lose in these specific scenarios?
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Ginn?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'm kind of curious. I want to back up to where you were working in Morgan County. You had the piece of property that was sold for stream mitigation credits and the value of what happened with that. One of the things for me, you said that property almost became worthless because they had sold the stream mitigation credit and they couldn't develop it. When I look across our state, I think our dean over here would tell me we have about 25 million acres of forested timber property in the state. And so when I look, does property that's not developable, does it not have any value?
No, it has a value. It's just, it could be nominal value. I've seen properties, 200, 300 acres that are no longer developable. You can't build anything on it. You can't even cut trees on them, but they still have a nominal value for one purpose only, and that's for hunting. They can still hunt that piece of property.
Recreational property.
Or it's holding the property together. It's recreational just to look at. But it has a value. It's nominal, and the diminution in value could be severe. It could be 60, 70, like I said, up to 90% loss in value because of those bundle of rights being taken away. But it still has some value. Nothing is totally worthless out there, except for, in our eyes, government property, churches, schools. Those are worthless to us because they're exempt. They have a value, but they don't pay taxes. So
So if I go back to one of Mr. Rehas's, if I've got a river and it's a very scenic river going across my property, said let's say it's got a 75-foot buffer on each side of it. Said where's the value of because I know if I go to market and I want to buy riverfront property, it's going to sell typically at a higher price than non-riverfront property.
correct.
So when I look from a taxation standpoint, they can't develop on that strip, and they may own a very minimal property. So on one hand, in reality, that property is selling more because it has that riverfront feature. But on the other hand, I can't do anything with it. I can't develop it. What's the internal struggle on that?
Well, the market wins in that scenario, period. Whatever the market is showing is what wins in that. Without the market, you have to rely on your instinct that these properties will be, the value will decrease because of the loss of rights on the buffer there. I mean, that's, in reality, if you don't have the sales, you have to lower the value. But if you have sales to show it, the value is raised up.
You fell into my next question and last question on it. I go back to the Morgan County property. Before it was sold for stream mitigation credits, you probably had it pretty low in value.
Oh, no doubt.
It gets sold for, I don't remember the number you quoted, said on the value of the stream mitigation credits, said but it was pretty high for Morgan County property. I'm a little bit familiar with what's going on there. So when I look, what's that do to the rest of the properties? Because you do mass appraisal. You're not well, you are a fee appraiser, but your work is in the county. You're doing mass appraisal. So how do you balance those two between mass appraisal? Okay, this guy sold the development rights off of it versus what's going on with the rest of the county, because you've just made the rest of the county that's not developed. Hey, that market's out there, and I could pick on one of our audience members to help me with that, but I won't.
That sale was an outlier. If I used that sale to value everybody else's property, you've heard of lynching before? Yeah, that's what would have happened. So.
Let's see if they have any other questions for the committee. We really appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
Part of what we're struggling with as a committee is to understand how to get this information out to the citizens of Georgia, and it can be a very complicated process. And I really appreciate your time, and if you'll stay afterwards, I'm sure there'll be questions.
I will.
All right, thank you very much. To our committee now, do you have, Senator, you wish? anything? All right, to our committee now with our resolution, and this is the question asked earlier, but the last part of our resolution talks about how we report as a committee, but I want to review right now where we are. We've had 2 meetings. We are approved for a total of 5 meetings. We can continue meeting. We can, at any point in time, if we reach a consensus, we can do a report to adopt recommendation with findings, or we can do a report without findings. If we feel that we're on a track where we need a lot more information, your chairman can just submit the committee meeting. So we're sort of at a crossroads here as to what way we want to go. And so if we just can stay in place for maybe about 5 minutes, what Chairman Ginn and I have discussed is what we really need from you are direct issues that you think we need to solve. And we know you can't come up with that right now, but if we could start compiling that, then we would be able to have our focuses if it's our determination to do a next meeting. So, Chairman Ginn, you want to say something before we just take a 5-minute break?
The one of the things that for me, and I appreciate in our last little 5-minute break, I'm not sure how my timetable worked out for 5 minutes, but Director
Southern
Dunn,
time.
Offered, and I would like to have kind of a more roundtable discussion amongst our committee members. Of course, that'll be open to the public, but Director Dunn offered the DNR boardroom over in the Sloppy Floyd Towers as a possible meeting location. For me, I think it would be very helpful if we could, as committee members, and I'll pick on my good friend Trey, if you can email, okay, where do you want to see us go? If there's different parts of the industry that we need to reach out to, parts of the community that we need to reach out to, but more importantly, what's the goals and objectives on how we move forward? We share those ideas. As y'all know, you heard me saying, I want to try to make it clear for the public to know what's right and what's wrong. Said everybody else, as we try to address that. I know Chairman Smith has talked about property rights and property values and how that's done. He said, but if we can, I would ask that as committee members, you give it a little thought, send some questions in for Mr. Bennett said he can compile those and send those back out to all of our committee members, and our next meeting would be more or less a roundtable discussion on if we can reach a consensus on voids that we see in the current situation with arrested vegetation and the court ruling on that, or anything that y'all feel like is important.
So let's take about a 5-minute break, just caucus among ourselves up here, and then I'll call us back to order. To make something like this work, we really would have to boil it down to specific goals or specific issues. So give y'all a little bit of time, and then we'll get back together and start hearing from our individual members. Thank you. So we will now get to our public comment part of our meeting today, and we have 3 people signed up. But if you've not signed up and wish to comment publicly to our committee, now's the time to do so. I have the sheet here, but certainly want to give anybody a chance who wishes to comment. So we have Bruce McGregor first. If you can come forward to the podium right over there, sir. And considering time, right around 5 minutes, not to exceed 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Bruce McGregor, and I'm a civilian. I'm representing no one but myself. I think there's a problem, a loophole problem in the rested vegetation. The people are beginning to put in retaining walls, sea walls, albeit without a sea, and all-mount driveways, whatever. And then, since there's no rested vegetation because there's a wall, then bingo, there's no buffer. And since the county buffers and the municipal buffers rely on the state buffer, if there's no state buffer, there's no county buffer. And so it's a loophole. It's an easy fix on that loophole, in my view. Instead of saying rested vegetation, it'd be rested vegetation or high water mark or top of bank. Easy fix. Now that doesn't fix things down on the coast, but in the Piedmont and above, I think that would do it. And this is becoming an increasing problem as people want to develop squirrelier and squirrelier lands. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next is Chris Manganiello. Is that correct? Correct my mispronunciation, or say good job. Either way.
It's close. It's close.
Okay.
I've it's been a little bit different everywhere I've ever been. Chris Manganiello, Water Policy Director at Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. Thanks for giving me the time. I just wanted to come up and what I'm getting ready to say kind of fits a little bit what Kathleen was up talking about. As many of you probably know, as a part of the state water plan, there are 11 regional water councils spread out throughout the state that are made up of members that are appointed by Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor. And these members of these councils, again, all over the state, have been meeting since 2010. Even before that. 2010 came out with our first regional water plans, again, spread throughout the state, and then just revised them again this current year. And 9 out of the 11 regional water councils recommend riparian buffers in urban and agricultural areas because these buffers are the most cost-effective tools to enhance water quality and water supply and to control runoff and reduce erosion. Right? So since 2008, State Water Plan has been meeting, and the members of these councils in the most recent regional plans are all endorsing the use and recommendation of riparian buffers for water quality and water supply purposes. For example, I think that perhaps one of the more interesting things, again, based on what Kathleen was talking about, is that at least 3 of these regional councils, the Coosa, North Georgia, the Middle Ocmulgee, and the Upper Oconee, they all have a recommendation that these councils should consider stream buffer, quote, consider stream buffer protection that goes beyond the current minimum state standards. Some of them go into discussion about how you could do that and whether or not you create kind of a regional model ordinance within the particular regional water council's boundaries. But I wanted to point out to you that this state water plan, EPD has been instrumental in organizing and shepherding and working with citizen council members to come up with these regional water plans. Streamside buffers and riparian buffers in urban and agricultural settings are all recommended, again, in 9 out of the 11. And of course, as you've heard, the Metro North Georgia Water Planning District also has their own kind of recommendations on stream buffers. I will say that one of their recommendations at the Metro District level is that local governments could create maps that clearly identify the appropriate stream buffers within their jurisdictions and incorporate these stream buffer maps into communities' zoning maps and other community planning efforts. Cobb County has done this. Cobb County has gone out and they have mapped all of their stream buffers. From a planning and zoning perspective, if rested vegetation is the kind of the the benchmark here, they could have mapped some buffer in their county that there's no arrested vegetation present. So that kind of creates some confusion and uncertainty at the planning and zoning level. So just going to keep that in mind of what's happening at the local level. The last thing I'll say is, and again, I was thinking about the map that Kathleen was showing, and I think that map is accurate. And without really knowing exactly, Senator Ginn, what is going on in Franklin County, based on what you were describing, and to some degree to, I think what Mr. Ehais was getting at is, if the goal of that map was to illustrate, counties that are meeting the statutory requirements, then Franklin County would be accurate, because so the rest of vegetation piece and buffers is in the Erosion Sedimentation Control Act. When we're talking about water supply, watersheds, and the buffers that are included in those, that's in the Mountain and River Corridors Protection Act, which is a separate statute which requires 150, 100-foot buffers depending on watershed size, and those are upstream of raw water, drinking water supply intakes. So again, just kind of reiterate that map would still be accurate if the question was simply to create a map that demonstrated counties that were meeting minimum statutory requirements, regardless of what statute we're talking about. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Rob Davino, is it Bueno? Del Bueno, yes. Bueno, right?
Bueno. Rob Del Bueno, just a concerned citizen. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on this. As a property owner in Georgia, I just want to ensure that while there are certainly valid concerns of property owners wishing to develop their property, that we're reminded that the rights to develop a property must be balanced with the rights of those that are affected by their development. And that we bear in mind that the rights of one are limited to the extent at which their actions negatively affect or impinge the rights of others. I'm the owner of some acreage in Douglas County, and recently a developer acquired a bunch of land adjacent to mine. The process of developing the land they acquired included significant clearing and grading work, for which, it's my understanding, they undertook reasonable engineering, gained all the required permits to operate within current legal compliance. But that said, during a recent storm, runoff from their site caused significant silt and sediment pollution into a stream on my property. Based on a review of the developer's retention pond, silt fencing, outflow design, etc., it's apparent that the current confusion regarding rested vegetation resulted in them deploying, what were clearly inadequate BMPs, poor site management, both of which resulted in pollution on my property. So in short, the developer's compliance with the current regulations ultimately led to my rights as a landowner being violated and my property being the recipient of pollution from their project. Hence, the current regulation does not serve the right of all property owners adequately, fairly, and as such should be modified. So it's not just the rights of the developers that should be considered when reviewing these matters, it's equally the rights of those property owners downstream of development. So that's it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir. So at this point in time, Chairman Ginn and I will just start with Mr. Monroe and just go around if you have any suggestions of what you wish us to do, meet again. Just go ahead and give us your suggestion. Tell me your press your number again so I can find the right one. Okay, thank you.
Well, being new to this process, this is my first time through a study committee, and very interesting. A lot of good information being presented, and very honored to be a part of this committee. I would definitely like to see at least one more meeting prior to providing any kind of goals and objectives that to see come out as a resolution from this committee. I guess my major concern and the reason that I feel like I'm on the committee is being a civil engineer and having to make the determinations work in terms of the ENS regulations. I'd like to see more clarity in terms of what is actually considered an intermittent stream. I think that's where the major confusion comes into play, and that's what I would like to see come out of this study committee is a good solid way for
even professionals in this field to come to agreement about what is actually a stream. And it's all currently, in my experience, very subjective. You could have 3 different people and have different ideas about what a stream is. So that's what I'd be looking for in terms of the result of this committee.
Thank you. Next, number 26, Mr. Reheis, or 25? 26. Okay. Hold on, I'm sorry, I missed. Okay, go ahead.
Sure, I think it's appropriate to have another meeting. I think Phil makes a good point that if there is in fact a significant difference or differences around the state in where a buffer applies, it's probably in how different people understand and determine what is an intermittent versus an ephemeral stream. And so if there is a way to improve upon the process or the definition of how you get there, I think that would be helpful. Aside from that, I suppose I'm biased, having been a regulator in the past and been involved with this. I'm not completely clear on what's broken that needs to be fixed, other than this fact that different people can interpret intermittent and ephemeral differently when you look at a stream.
Thank you. 25? There.
Yes, Madam Chair. I believe we're at a stage where additional testimony is probably not needed. I think I would be in favor of a process where we now go into the identification of issues and the application of the current law. You know, in Harold's words, what is broken, what works, what is broken, and then we go into some sort of deliberation about whether these issues should be addressed and how those issues should be addressed in kind of a roundtable fashion. So that's where I would stand.
Thank you, sir. We pass on down. Senator Hill, if you'll push your button. Number 12. Thank you, sir.
I don't have anything today. I'm interested in the process, and I look forward to the roundtable discussion we'll have.
Thank you, sir. Number 9, 10. 10. Okay. Let's get. Oh, hold on. There you go.
I concur with the director's comments in total. I believe another meeting is warranted. I think one in like a spitballing type fashion would probably be better, so we can actually like start throwing some actual ideas out on the table, and I'll probably get more specific on my ideas on the email to Trey.
All right. Thank you. Number 9. Okay.
Yes, I'm in agreement with everyone thus far. I mean, I think we've gathered a lot of information, and now we need to kind of figure out what we do with it.
Thank you. Number 4. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike Worley, and I do feel it's time for us to begin the deliberative process of kind of assembling the information that we've received and trying to put it together in some type of format. I do believe I've heard a couple of folks say, you know, not sure that they see anything broken, but I think that the Georgia Supreme Court has given an indication that something is broken here, and perhaps we should figure out a way to address that particular component as we move into our deliberations.
Thank you. Number 3, Dr. Green.
Well, I'm in favor of another meeting. Don't really have anything else to add. Coming last year, I think all the salient points have been hit.
Thank you. I had heard a couple of our committee members saying that we had left it open with Gerald Pouncey for a little bit more information to our question. That's the only thing I'm not clear of. Would we want another presentation on that information? So I guess let's do a vote. All those in favor of bringing back, come on, Gerald Pouncey to answer our question about how the definition is and do we need more rules and regs. So all those in favor, aye. Opposed? Okay. Any further discussion? All right, we'll do that. That'll be our one presenter, and then we'll break down in as and debate our issues. So those in favor, one more meeting at least, and how we identify our issues that we feel we need to be discussing. Let's just do a motion to do that. All those in favor, aye. Any opposed? Any further discussion? Okay, we have taken our action for our next meeting. So for our committee, the direction to us is that we need to try and write down or put down and get to Trey and then to David Hartman our suggested issues that we feel need further definition. We've mentioned them a little bit today, but it would help us to have specific goals and issues. And at that point in time, we'll also try and poll you on an available date for our next meeting. We are bumping up against Thanksgiving and then also against Christmas and end of the year reports. So let's just go from there. And to the people who have been listening to us for several hours, thank you very much for your patience. And those who did public comment, we appreciate that. And we'll continue with the process. We stand adjourned.